In this video, I'm going to walk you through the installation instructions to replace the factory rear fender with the Vagabond Motorsports Fender Eliminator kit on your FZ-09. Now before we get into the actual installation portion of the video, I just want to go over some of the key details of the Vagabond Motorsports Fender Eliminator kit for the Yamaha FZ-09. It's good for all your FZ-09s, so starting 2014 models and newer. It's a two-piece design. It's going to have a frame mount and a license plate mount, both of which are CNC laser cut and bent out of 1/8 inch thick aluminum, covered in UV resistant black powder coat finish. So it should be extremely durable and it won't corrode. So the frame mount is going to come with these stud protectors on them that are going to cover the stainless steel studs that'll interface with the factory design. You can go ahead and take those off and toss them. The license plate mount is going to come with rubber bumpers on the bottom to minimize license plate vibration. It'll reduce any chance you have of cracking the plate or having a rattle or a buzzing sound. And it's going to also have mil-spec rubber grommet up at the top of the license plate light. It's going to seal all the cables coming into the tail section of the motorcycle. The kit comes with a full set of color instructions, step by step, to help you through the process. Kind of augment this video. And then it's going to come with 2 sets of washers and a set of 4 bolts. And the 4 bolts and washers in this little packet are going to connect the 2 pieces of the Fender Eliminator. Stainless steel washers are going to be used to reuse your factory OEM Yamaha turn signals, and these black plastic shoulder washers are going to be used to install any number of aftermarket, typically LED turn signals that use the very common M10 stud. Now as for tools you're going to need to complete the installation, I'm going to start off with a flathead screwdriver. You need 8 and 10 millimeter hex sockets, and it's very useful to have a ratcheting driver. You're going to need tin snips to reuse your factory turn signals, so you won't need those if you're putting in aftermarket turn signals. It is very useful to have needle nose pliers or something similar just to hold the little plastic rivets to reassemble the body components, and you'll see why later. And then the last thing you will need is a 4 millimeter Allen wrench. Now the first step of the installation procedure is going to be to remove your the seat for the FZ-09, and that's going to be using the key in the underside key slot on the tail section of the bike. Now it's a key point to make is that little plastic trap door that's going to cover up the key slot is going to disappear as part of this installation. So if that's a deal breaker for you, get a hold of us and return the parts before you get there and figure that out. So once you get the seat off, next thing we're going to do is remove these 2 plastic side panels. So we're going to start with the bolts up top, and then we'll move to the little plastic rivets down at the bottom. So this is going to be 4 of your 10 millimeter head bolts. So you're going to use your 10 millimeter socket and ratchet to loosen up these 4 corner bolts. And once you get the top ones out, set them aside. They will be reused. And we'll move to the underside of the bike and remove the plastic rivets that hold the rest of the body panels together. Alright, and the next part is going to be removing the 7 plastic rivets that are holding all the plastic panels on the other side of the bike together. Now, they are highlighted in the instructions as well, but there's 7. So there's 2 on the back, 4 at the front, and then there's 1 in the middle. And if you've never taken these out, the easiest way I find is to use a screwdriver. You can use your flathead screwdriver in this point and pop the center of them in, and you'll hear them click, and that means they've released. And then you just have to slide your fingernail underneath the head and pop them out. And these will be reused, so try not to scratch them up. What you will notice is that the ones at the back are slightly different than some of the other ones. Some of them have wide heads on them and some of them have skinny heads on them. And, oh, that's not the right thing. The 2 at the back are going to have the kind of smaller diameter heads. And it's important not to mix those up because they won't tighten your plastics back up sufficiently otherwise. So once you get all 7 of these out, sometimes you need to give it a little extra push. set those aside. You can slide out the two side panels, and again, set those aside. So now that the rear plastics are off, we can go ahead and take this seat latch plate off. And we need to take this plate off because we need access to the 4 nuts underneath it. So using your 10mm socket, or sorry, pardon me, 8mm hex head socket, you're going to remove these 4 bolts. Now, all of these you're going to reuse, so set them aside and try not to lose any. Okay, and that's going to engage with the cable pull to latch your seat. So now that we've got that plate off, we're going to start with the wiring connectors that are going to your turn signals and your license plate light. So you can kind of start to pull this loom of cabling out, and this big connector back here is actually your tail light, so you don't actually need to remove that. But you will have black connector and a gray connector. Those are going to be your 2 turn signals, and you just lift the tab to pull them. And then you're going to have, on FZ-09 there's actually bullet connectors, and that's actually for your turn signal, or sorry, your license plate light, and those are just going to pull apart. So you can use needle nose pliers if you need help. Otherwise, you should be able to grasp kind of the 2 sides and unplug them, and just keep in mind that those are going to go back together again, and you're going to keep these are just the insulating boots for them, so don't lose those either. But with that being said, now that the connectors are removed, you have everything ready to kind of clear it out of the little plastic channels helping it, and all 3 of these looms are going straight through that rectangular hole. So that's going to pull through with the factory fender, and once you've got yourself to this point, you're going to swap your 8mm for your 10mm wrench, and you're going to take these 4 nuts off. And just like most things, recommend at least loosening all of them first, just so that you don't end up with too much load on one and potentially damage something. We are going to reuse these nuts, so keep track of them. And once these are locking nuts, so you'll feel them get a little easier once you pass the locking portion of them. So be mindful not to lose track of these guys. But once you get off the locking portion, I recommend you put the wrench down and support, there you go, support the fender by hand. Oh, now it's popped off. And get the last few threads off such that it doesn't fall out. You're gonna jiggle it loose and guide those cables back through. And you can notice your tail light is actually loose, and if you are worried about it hanging there by its connector, you can remove it. If you're gentle, you can just leave it right there. At this point, we're going to take the factory fender to the bench, break it down, and kind of take what we need out of it. So once you get your factory fender onto your bench, first thing you're going to do is remove your license plate. This hardware kind of varies from dealer to dealer. In this case, and I think generally speaking, use that flathead screwdriver for this. But as I said, that may vary depending on the dealer that prepped your bike. So if it's not a flathead, that's the reason. So once we get that off, we're going to go about dismantling your factory light. So on the FZ-09, you should be able to snake your wires out of this channel without actually dismantling the whole channel, which is nice. So if you're only going to do your license plate light and you have aftermarket turn signals, no need to pull the turn signals out. But in this scenario, we're going to be reusing the factory turn signals. So we will pull all 3 harnesses out. So if you're going to reuse the factory turn signals, the Yamaha turn signals have an interesting design where there's 2 rubber little flaps that connect to a plastic insert, and if you remove those flaps off the insert, you can get the insert out and then just pull the turn signal out from that little groove. So we're going to do that twice, and I'll see if I can do it a little more clearly this time. You can see those 2 little flaps, and if you can pull up on the flap with one finger and then push the plastic plug out with the other one, get the insert out, and then just pull out the turn signal. As for the license plate light, it is going to have 2 rather large 8mm nuts kind of buried down in there, and you may or may not want to use an extension, but we're going to loosen those. Now we will reuse these, so that's part of our philosophy here at Vagabond, is that we reuse as much of the nice factory components as possible. 1, to save you money, 2, so that you have a really factory appearance, and the quality is extremely good. So, okay. Alright, so once you've got both of these kind of interesting looking large nuts out, set those aside, and then just pull your license plate light, which we will reuse, out, and set your factory fender to the side. And we're going to go about reassembling or assembling the license plate mount portion of the Fender Eliminator. It's going to come pre-installed with a rubber grommet up top, just because we're going to be shoving electrical connectors through here. It's going to be easier to remove this and reinstall it once we pass all the connectors. So remove that grommet and set it aside. Now we're going to go about rebuilding the the factory components onto the Vagabond Motorsports Fender Eliminator. So with the license plate light, you can take your bullet connectors, pass them through the first circular hole, and then up through the second circular hole. And like I mentioned, we're going to reuse those 2 large 8mm nuts, and they should go on a little easier than they were to come off. And there's going to be a lot of thread on them, but that's okay. They're never going to come off. Got one done. Jam on the second one. And there's a little bit of the through holes in the Fender Eliminator for these are a little oversized, such that if you try really hard you can get that light a little misaligned. So the easy way is to make sure they're just barely tight, and then you have the opportunity to kind of jiggle it around a bit. And once you get it nice and perfectly straight, go back and tighten these guys up. And you don't need to go overkill with tightening these because there's not a lot of load on them, but snug them up. Then we're going to move to the turn signals. Now, in this installation video, we're going to use the factory turn signals, which is only just going to use this central column of stainless steel washers. If you've got aftermarket turn signals, you're going to not use any of these. Use the nut supplied with your turn signal, and use these to fill in a little bit of this extra, the gap, because we need a hole this large for the factory turn signals. So, speaking of the factory turn signals, we are going to use them without this boot section, just because it's way too floppy. I'm not sure if you guys are as bugged by that as I am, but there's an 8mm nut deep inside that we're going to reuse, so don't throw it away. Once you remove that 8mm nut, you can pop the boot off and see where we have a little bit of a interesting problem where there's a little metal retainer in here, and we're not going to be able to slide that retainer past the connector. So rather than having to cut and resolder the connector, it's much easier to use your snips, and obviously don't cut the wire, cut a little portion of the retainer and then grab it again. Don't cut it, but you can kind of flex it open, and that will allow you to get a little bit more actually your cabling out. You can always flatten this back out, put it back on, flatten it out, and reuse it with your rubber boot if you ever need to reinstall. But because we are not doing that, once you get that retainer off, you can slide and be gentle. Get the connector out. There you go. Alright, so at this point, the retainer and the boot are storage. So set them aside, keep them, toss them, whatever you choose. Now, so because this is the right turn signal, we'll start with that. And I'll show you how the stack of washers is going to go. So open up your washer stack that's supplied by Vagabond, and you're going to notice there are two of each style of washer in the stack that we're going to use, because you can see there's a shoulder on this factory turn signal. So that's going to go inside the hole all the way up to that big shoulder, and we're going to use this stack of washers to take up the rest of the slack. So once we plug it through Fender Eliminator, the order of operation is going to be the large washer, the large lock washer, and then this fender washer. And then we're going to reuse, where have they run off to? We're going to reuse, pardon me, the little 8mm nut that came on your turn signal, and that's going to clamp the whole thing together. That'll make it nice and tight, and you won't risk pulling anything out. So let me show you how we do that. So you start by threading the wiring loom through both sets of holes, and you can see there's a little keyhole, a little notch in the license plate mount portion of the Fender Eliminator, and that's actually going to hold, especially if you pull this jacket back a little bit, you see there's only two little small conductor wires back there. Those are going to live in this little keyhole such that our washer stack won't pinch them. That's an important thing to keep track of, not pinching that cabling going through. So it requires a little bit of patience, and it helps to kind of understand which components are doing what. And so what I like to do is kind of grasp it, put it aside, so close that gap, get your wires into that keyhole, and then start with your assembly. And like I said, it goes large washer, large flat washer, fender washer. And you can start this stack with everything not quite aligned, but what you're going to want to do is get that large washer pushed down, the fender washer around the boss. And it does take a tiny bit of kind of playing around to get it all to fit, but once you've got it aligned, in this case I'm just going to use cranking a little bit of tightness here. You can see I'm having a tiny bit of trouble getting the lock washer around, so if it starts to feel too tight too early, I'm sure that's the case. There we go. So what you should see is you should see the lock washer start to compress down around that shoulder, and then you can get your 8mm go in the right direction, hopefully. Tighten it up, and I just lost it. There we go. So once I'm going to get it relatively tight, and you'll feel everything snug up. So you'll see the wires are coming out of that keyhole, and we're going to do this on the other side. But while it's still a little, not totally bottomed out, you can see there's a little bit of angle adjustability, and you can actually adjust that at the very last minute once it's on the bike. But it's good to get it close, and then you can again use your 8mm socket and tighten it up, send it home. So what you really want to make sure is that those wires coming through are in the keyhole, and in this case they are. And we'll do a systems check at the end just to make sure. So you can see we've got both right and left turn signals on there, and one of the things I just want to reinforce is that if you pull this jacket up, you should definitely be able to see your two conductors from your cable passing through there. And if you see that anything is either caught or pinched by that washer stack, you may want to loosen it up and try again. But point the turn signals about where you think they should go, at least level with each other, and then we can always adjust them once they get back on the bike. So the last part of this assembly step is going to be start passing through all your 3 electrical connectors through that grommet that we removed. And it's going to be easier to stretch them all through at this point and then insert the grommet, as opposed to trying to force them all through, connectors and all, because we want this to be tight kind of by design such that water doesn't get kicked up. So this is a little bit of a brute force, but once you get it close, start with an edge and you'll kind of feed that gap. Get that little groove pushed into the fender eliminator. Kind of work your way around. It's not the easiest thing in the world, but it doesn't take much. So then you can see your 3 coming out. Should be nice and kind of snug. You can pull them all snug, and you'll see 1, 2, 3 going through. That's what you want to see. So at this point, this setup is ready to get installed back onto the motorcycle. So we'll move to the frame mount portion of the installation. At this point, you're going to be able to take the smaller part, the frame mount part of the fender eliminator, install it onto the motorcycle. You're going to reuse those 4 10mm locking nuts from the factory setup. Now, all you have to do is line the 4 studs up with the 4 holes in the bottom, and keep in mind that the back 2 are also going to pick up the tail light. And so what I like to do is get a few threads on each of them before you start tightening anything. And what you just need to double check, and it should line right up, is that the second circular hole in this frame mount should go right around the key boss for the seat lock. So that should be a nice clean surround, and you can use that to center up any sort of gaps you have. And once you're tight on at least the locking portion of the nut, you grab your 10mm wrench and tighten everything back up. So at this point, we're very much in the reassembly portion of the video. So we're going to get this frame mount back on, and then we can go about the business of putting the factory seat latch and plastic sack on. Now, because once you put that seat crossbar on, you're going to block at least these bottom 2. You want to at least do a visual check. Everything looks fairly well lined up. Seat boss, the key boss is nice and surrounded. Your tail light is nice and straight. And once you've kind of convinced yourself of that, go about and give these your final torque. Once you've got the frame mount on, we can go about putting the license plate portion of the Fender Eliminator on, and there's going to be a little column of screws in your fastener pack that are going to have 4 bolts for locking washers. And so you're just going to stack a lock washer on top of each bolt and use those to connect the two. And at this point, we don't need to go to full tightness. We only need to get a few screws in, or a few threads in, pardon me, so that we can finish up the wiring. What you're going to do is you're going to pass the 3 wiring looms through the hole in the frame mount, and you'll see that the rubber grommet portion of things is going to line right up with that circular bolt. You're going to take your 4mm Allen wrench and take a bolt with a lock washer on it, and I like to just start one at a time, but get it up there and get a few threads on it. It doesn't need to be full tight. There's a couple ways you can always put your plastics on first, and then go about the business of trying to tuck your wires in at the very end. But I like this way just because you can get all your wiring squared away now before you put that seat latch plate back on, which is it's important that you don't have to mess around with that too much. One of the things I really like about this Fender Eliminator on FZ-09 is that the factory taillight ends up taking up a portion of this little weird cutout in the factory taillight, and kind of fills in some gaps in the body lines. So once you get the license plate portion of the Fender Eliminator up, we can go and take care of all the wiring. So the connectors themselves are fairly easy. The bullet connectors, it should be relatively clear to see which one connect back to each other. They're also color coded such that you always get the same one. You just want to make sure that that insulation portion covers any kind of exposed metal, such that you're not opening yourself up to risk of a short. And those you can do by hand. If you're having trouble getting them to fully seat, you can use needle nose pliers for that section of it. Outside of that, it's going to be, try to make sure these things are not twisted too much. And then just black to black, gray to gray for your 2 turn signals. Then you're left with the somewhat challenging part of packing all the wires back in the kind of the original channels that they had. And the easiest way, in my opinion, to do that is to take advantage of some of the room under the latch plate, and that's why I like to do this now. So once you put the latch plate on, you're not worried about kind of shoving wires in where they don't belong. So I tend to fold everything over on itself, quite like that. You kind of cover up your connectors, and then the nice thing is that once you put your latch plate on, all these guys are, for the most part, they are locked in place. So that's going to be the next step. So you're going to grab your latch plate and the 4 8mm head screws, and really the only thing you have to check is that the little arm in the latch plate fits back into the 2 kind of actuator slots, and that should be relatively kind of, maybe not self-explanatory, but it should go back together. And obviously I'd always recommend cycling through, make sure you put your key into the locking mechanism or the seat release mechanism before you clip your seat down for the first time. So we'll do that really quick just to make sure that you should be able to see the locking latch cycle with the key cycle. So going to, you can see it. So as long as you can do that, you should be safe to fully button up the motorcycle at this point. Put the key to the side. So you're going to use your wrench and a 10mm socket, or sorry, screw that up again, 8mm socket, and secure that seat latch plate to the subframe. Now at this point, all we're left with are the plastic body panels and the rider seat. So body panels will be just the last little tricky bit. So as you go to install the side panels, you may notice that we've lost a lot of clearance here. And so you're not going to have to wrestle with them, but you will have to kind of slide your side panels over. And if your turn signals are way out of whack, they may kind of close that gap to the point where it doesn't want to go back together. And if you do have that problem, then you're going to have to loosen your turn signals and clock them appropriately. So once we get the panels kind of loosely in place, you're going to go about tightening the 4 bolts up top and then the plastic rivets at the bottom. And for the plastic rivets at the bottom, you're going to want to pop them back such that the little central head pops up, and that's going to be how you're actually securing everything together. So pop all those rivets up before you install them. And this is the part that there's 2 that are going to be a little tricky, and those are going to be the 2 small diameter ones, so we'll do those last. But I'll move the camera so we can go over those right now. And I recommend, it's a little easier to do the plastic panels first and then the bolt second, just because the panels are easier to realign. So I'm going to start with the 4 or 5 plastic rivets at the front. Just kind of align them with the hole in the corresponding part of the frame, and you should feel everything kind of snug up when you depress that center and click them to lock them. And the 5 at the front are all the same. So you should feel things kind of start to tighten up. Now for my money, the ones at the back are going to be the hardest, and they are tucked up, especially if you have the factory turn signals. They are way directly in the way, and you can either use, it's actually not too bad with your fingers, kind of guide them in, but if that is causing you grief, that's what the needle and pliers are listed on the instructions for, to help you with that part of it. So once you've got the plastic rivets in, the last step is going to be to take those 4 10mm head, they do have a little bit of a shoulder on them to align the plastics, bolts, and re-secure those to the subframe. And that's going to be your 10mm socket. Alright, so once you're got those 4 bolts tightened, and one thing you always want to check with these shoulder screws is that you're actually not crushing the plastic with the shoulder. You want the shoulder to go through the hole in the plastic and tighten up against the metal such that you can actually give it full torque and not worry about cracking plastic. So if you ever feel like it's getting tight too early, back it off and realign it. Once you've got those guys down, all that's left is going to be the seat. And hopefully you've cycled your seat latch earlier so you know that it's functioning appropriately. Then line it all up. Perfect. Alright, just the last step. It's going to be reinstalling your license plate. And like I said earlier, that hardware I'd reuse, providing you like it, whatever the dealer put your bike with. And once we're done with that, we'll give it a quick system check. And then what I would recommend is that you take this opportunity to, I guess, aim your turn signals at the rear appropriately. So if you left a little bit of slack in those nuts, you can see I have a little ability to get these right. So now that they're on the bike, you'll be able to pick what is dead horizontal, what looks best for you, and then you'll use that 8mm wrench to tighten it up. So once you've got the plate on, we're going to, it's worth it, just do a quick check, make sure all your connections are right. So you'll see the license plate light illuminate, and then we'll just do a quick left turn signal, right turn signal. So that means you haven't pinched any cables, and that's a good sign. Now, with that being said, we're all done with the installation. Give you a quick walk around of the results. You should be able to see there's a nice kind of closeout around the key slot for the tail release or the seat release. You can see there's really tight gaps, but no rubbing, no interference, but everything kind of packs up nice and tightly into the tail section of the FZ-09. So that typically gives it a much cleaner appearance than the factory rear fender. It's all OEM lights, so it's all very high quality. Thanks for checking us out. I'd encourage you to look us up at www.vagabondmotorsports.com, and our products can also be found direct for Prime members on Amazon. Thank you.